All right, so tonight we are going to be talking a little bit about learning. Now let's see if we can share the screen here. Okay, so here we go. So learning, and what is that all about? You know, learning is something that actually happens automatically, believe it or not, despite what the national education system has to tell you. Learning happens whether you're in a classroom or not. You're always assimilating information, figuring out what it means, and trying to use that information to the best of your ability to survive the world and to navigate your society or your environment, whatever that might be. So tonight we're going to look at a little bit of an introduction on what learning is and how that might take place from a psychological point of view. So what is learning? Well, according to this, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge due to experience. Plays a central role in most aspects of human behavior. Do any of you have any examples of something really complex you learned, a skill or something you had to learn for school or something you wanted to learn for fun? And can you take us through the process of how you learned that particular thing? Anybody want to volunteer to talk about that?
I think my example would be learning an instrument. I learned how to play the cello.
Cello? Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like a very big viola.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, it just took a lot of years to get the muscle memory and stuff down.
How long have you been playing cello?
7 years now.
Wow.
Since the beginning of middle school.
So what method did you learn to play it? Did you learn the Suzuki method? Did you learn reading my music first? What did you learn? How did you
so core, I was in my band class. So I would say we mostly learned from there. And we had Suzuki books that we played from. So, you know, we'd like play from this piece, play from that piece. We'd try to learn the different pieces for our concerts. And then eventually got a private teacher.
Okay. So when you first got the introduction to the cello, you're looking at it and you may have watched some videos or you kind of had an inkling what this might be and you decided you were going to choose this instrument. Did you choose it or did your parents choose it for you?
No, it was super cool. My middle school did like an instrument petting zoo. So they'd have the 8th graders all with their separate instruments and we could give it a try for a bit.
Oh, nice.
And the violin and viola just sounded awful, I thought, because I played them when they were so squeaky.
Yeah.
And so the cello was a lot lower, so I like that better.
Okay, nice. So you got some introduction to it, and then through both practice, meaning you tried to play, you were corrected and playing the right way. You learned that certain sounds corresponded to certain squiggles of lines or notes on a page, and you slowly learn how to play from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
yes, exactly.
So memorization and learning, and it's an ongoing thing. So anybody else have anything that they learned they want to talk about?
I guess I learned writing over time, or like creative writing, just for fun.
Creative writing.
Like I write fiction stories every moment. So
awesome.
The way I learned that was kind of just like I learned just basic writing structure through school and stuff. And then I would say I learned more like fiction technique just by reading a bunch of books to the point where I would just like be able to identify, here's what makes like a good part of a story, here's what doesn't. Here's just something that works on this, so on and so forth. So I basically just realized, oh wait, I guess I could write now.
Awesome. Yeah, I love creative writing as well. I'm not particularly good at it, but I do really enjoy it. I like coming up with scenarios, and I'm really an expert at writing prompts. I know how to write a really good writing prompt to get people started. I just don't know how to finish it. But from what you're saying is that you kind of learned the structure of plot lines and what it was to create a good story, work of fiction. And so you mimicked that a bit, and then you also had added some of your own creativity and came up with your own stuff in there as well. Awesome. Anybody else want to share anything about something they've learned?
I'd say maybe coding.
Coding.
So like a lot of the learning was just like repetition and like actually working through the problems. So like it'd be like learning how certain operators work and then applying that and seeing like, I don't know, what I get when I input something and stuff like that. But a lot of it was just repetition and trying to understand how everything worked with each other, sort of.
Yeah, Isabella learned coding and trying to figure that out. You said that you worked through repetition, understanding what the code means, and then running the code and figuring out if it's going to work. Yeah, I learned BASIC and C++ back in the day. Don't even ask me what any of it means now because it's been so long, but I remember being able to do some of that, and it's really a neat skill and very interesting.
Yeah, and then I started with Java, and then this year I moved into learning how to use C. And what I noticed is like the format of a lot of it is the same. It's just like a different language. So certain parts of it just like it looks different, but a lot of it runs similarly.
It builds on each other. It's a similar kind of logic in some ways, isn't it? So a more analytical way of learning things in some ways, but still, I've always been admired really good coders because there's certainly a creative aspect to that as well. Fascinating. Good. Those are great examples of learning. And so we're going to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what it's all about. The first kind of learning we're going to talk about a little bit tonight is called classical conditioning. And this was first demonstrated by Ivan Pavlov. And you may have heard about Pavlov's dogs, or, you know, they're so ubiquitous now, and so much of this stuff in psychology has entered into the popular culture that sometimes even in my introduction classes, students already have at least an inkling of what it might be about. But basically, Pavlov was actually a physiologist, and he was not a psychologist, and he was actually trying to figure out and study salivation of dogs. But what he found was that when he would walk into his laboratory to go feed his dogs, he had this salivation sensor on the dog's mouth. And he began to notice that even before he pulled out the food, they saw the food, or they smelled the food, they began to salivate. And this is something that had happened over time. And he was trying to figure out why exactly that was the case. Why had that happened? So here is a picture of Pavlov himself. That's Pavlov there and his dog, and these are his associates. So what he found was that there is an unconditioned stimulus, or you can also think about it as a natural stimulus. So food naturally causes most animals, especially mammals, of which we're mammals, to salivate. You know, if you've ever been really hungry and someone starts talking about what they're going to get and how delicious it is, and they begin to describe the texture of the food and what it tastes like and what the flavor would be and how tart it might have been, or how sweet or how savory it could have been, you know, you begin to kind of salivate yourself a little bit. That's a natural or unconditioned stimulus that provokes a natural or unconditioned response, which is salivation. Now, in his original findings, what he found was that just his footsteps became a stimulus that yielded a different kind of response. But in order to test that what he was seeing was accurate, he actually put in a neutral tone, or what he actually used was a bell. I used to have a bell over here that I used to ring, and I have misplaced it somewhere. It might be in my UCF office. But he would ring a bell and then present the food. Ring a bell and present the food. Ring a bell and present the food. So in that process of conditioning, ringing the bell followed by presenting the food yielded salivation until the bell and the salivation and the stimulus, or the meat powder, it says here, or the food, were paired together to the point where the bell alone created the salivation response. So that's the conditioned stimulus. Then the bell or the tone became the conditioned stimulus, and that yielded the conditioned response, which is salivation. That's classical conditioning in a nutshell. Sometimes you see classical conditioning with human beings. A lot of times our traffic system is based on classical conditioning. You know, you go up to a red light, you see red, you automatically, you know, press your foot on the brake, where you see green and you go. You know, those are all conditioned responses of sorts. So conditioned responses over time, a conditioned response might be lost. So, you know, you can train a dog to do certain things. My dog doesn't respond to the sound of a bell because I haven't conditioned that response, but he does respond to the bell, to the sound of the ceramic container where his treats are. He responds to those, to that sound whenever I opened it. And you hear this tink, tink, tink sound, and he knows that's the treat bowl because that's the only bowl that really makes that sound, and he comes running. Now, over time, if I got rid of that bowl and I put it in another one and stopped pairing that sound with his treats, then that conditioned response would go extinct. And extinction is the loss of a conditioned response over time, and it can be quickly relearned through recondition. In fact, it's relearned quicker because those neural pathways have already been set up, even though the creature or the person has extinguished it, or it's been lost in some ways. Then you have spontaneous recovery, which is temporary reappearance of a conditioned response after extinction. You see that sometimes when animals have been trained for a certain thing. So here it is in graph form. You have the acquisition phase of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired. The extinction phase is when the unconditioned stimulus is withheld, that's food. And then in our previous example, and then this is spontaneous recovery or conditioned stimulus again presented, extinction if the unconditioned stimulus again is withheld. Now here's stimulus generalization, is the amount of saliva or the sound of a buzzer, and it has different frequencies. So what they found was that over time, the dog would salivate to almost any frequency of the buzzer or the sound. That's called stimulus generalization. In the real world, you sometimes will see stimulus generalization in terms of phobias. Phobias really are nothing more than classically conditioned responses. So for example, someone might be afraid of a spider, for example, but then it gets generalized to any 8-legged looking thing or creature. So a toy that looks like it might have 8 legs, or, you know, maybe even a ripped up eraser that kind of looks like a spider, or a crab, or all kinds of different things that kind of reminds the person of a spider, even though the spider is what is scaring them in the phobia. Because they're now generalizing it, it becomes a much more generalized kind of phobia. So in this slide, it says the signaling of significant events are conditioned responses, simply robot-like reflexive responses. Sometimes they are, sometimes there is cognitive mediation that happens in between those. Sometimes these conditioned responses are important for our adaptation or survival. If you can imagine ourselves, 10, 15, 20,000 years ago, we were all hunter-gatherers. This is before even the age of agriculture. And we were having to roam from place to place, following the seasons, depending on what was in bloom and what we could gather, what nuts were being born on trees, or what berries were being produced, what roots we could find, or even what herds we could follow to find food. We would wander around in our little human tribes of probably no more than about 30 people. Most hunter-gatherer tribes that are left on the planet today are fairly small, and usually a single tribe of about 30 people is about as much as what could have been supported back then. And we may have real early on had a conditioned response to the rustling of reeds, because we knew when the reeds rustled in a certain way, that might have meant that there is a saber-toothed tiger back there, or a wild boar, or a leopard, or something that's going to eat us. And so we learned to jump at that conditioned response of the rustling of the reeds and run like the wind to be able to get away from that. So that's one way that classical conditioning may have helped us evolutionary wise, or helped our survival. So what determines whether conditioned responses are learned? So responses develop when one event signals the appearance of another event. And that might have to do with timing, predictability, intensity, attention, whether we are prepared biologically. For example, we may have conditioned taste aversions. Have any of you ever eaten something and you ate a little bit too much of it? Or you ate a really bad thing of it and you never wanted to eat it again? Anybody have an example of that?
Yeah, actually, I used to eat hummus all the time in middle school, but I ate too much of it and now I just dislike it completely.
So David ate too much of it. It got gross, and he developed what's known as the conditioned taste aversion. He just cannot stand it any longer. Yeah, that's a good example. Higher order conditioning is a type of kind of early warning system. So you can actually have classical conditioning in a chained response, where one conditioned stimulus activates another down the line until you have a whole set of behaviors that might be set up due to classical conditioning. Some applications for classical conditioning. We talked about phobias a little bit a while ago. Does anybody have a phobia you want to share with us? No one wants to share their deep inner dark secrets regarding their fears. Well,
I have a question, actually.
Elizabeth, okay.
So there's a fear of, I think it's considered a phobia, of holes closely gathered together to one another. How did that develop? What evolutionary thing? Why would that be a fear exactly?
Are you talking about seeing a pattern of several holes in a single pattern, and how it sometimes we have an aversion response to that as human beings? Is that what you're referring to? Or are you referring to large holes in the ground?
No, I'm referring to small patterns of holes, like for certain.
I think it's called trypophobia.
Right.
Yes, that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. That's one that was recently discovered. They've known for many years that humans have a natural phobia to reptiles even infants sometimes will have an aversion to reptiles and to, as well as to loud noises. And infants do learn a fear of height, even on their own pretty quickly. Why the tiny patterns of holes, who knows, maybe at some point that would signify that there's something living in there that we don't want to touch because it's going to sting us or, harm us in some way. I know that we're also hardwired for facial recognition. So, human beings, we're constantly seeking out faces and things that look like human faces. And so even when we see, 2 holes up top, 1 hole at the bottom, and another hole, and it may just be a random pattern in nature, you'll see this sometimes in trees or on vegetation or even on insects. You'll say, that looks like a human face. So I don't know if that's a part of it as well. I have read about that, but what the source of it or what evolutionary purpose it might hold is your guess is as good as mine. I haven't really read anything about that. My guess is that it probably has to do with insects and avoiding those. So I don't know. Anybody have any idea about it, or did you have an idea about it, Elizabeth?
Well, I don't really know if I have trypophobia, but I know that if I see a lot of like small holes gathered together, my immediate response is actually my gag reflex. I want to throw up.
It's weird, yeah.
But that's just my experience. I don't know about anyone else's.
I've read that from like some random source on the internet that has something to do with because we associate like small clusters of patterns with disease. So we look at it and we think it's like, oh, this is like a rash or someone's sick, and we don't want to catch it, something like that.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, could very
well. It does.
It could be that it also connects over to bugs and stuff.
Yeah.
Because of the way bugs burrow down and bite and eat stuff.
Yep.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Well, phobias are things that often as a clinical psychologist, I have people will come into my office and their big thing is they want to get over a particular phobia. So one of the ways that you can do that is the first thing you have to do is figure out what exactly are they afraid of? How do they want to get rid of or why do they want to get rid of the phobia? And is it affecting their day-to-day functioning? So one good example is I had a businessman that came in to see me many years ago, and he had a phobia of flying. Now, he had kind of worked his way up this corporation and his phobia of flying really didn't affect him because he was able to drive to the different stores and such that he was managing in this corporation until he got a big promotion and he became regional vice president. And the region was from Washington, D.C. to Houston, Texas. And there was no more driving that could be done because the region was just too large, and it was he had to start flying. And so he's like, I start this new job in about 8 weeks. I've got to get over this fear of flying. You've got to help me. So one of the things we did is something called systematic desensitization. And what that is that you first create a hierarchy of fears with the person. So in this case, with the businessman, we looked at his lowest level fear in association with fear of flying was simply the fear of thinking about getting on an airplane. So just thinking about it caused a certain level 1, level 2 amount of fear. Level 10 level fear was actually being on the plane. You're 25,000 feet up. There's turbulence going on. It's storming. The captain says, fasten your seatbelts, and the ultimate fear is we're going down and we're all going to die. That was his ultimate fear. So we began working on what's called mindfulness and meditation. So basically learning how to relax. You want to have a an alert and awake mind and a calm, relaxed body. That's what mindfulness is. So we began working on mindfulness and doing some meditation in the therapy office. And then when he would get into a very relaxed position, we would then introduce the first level of fear until he got to a point where he felt it was tolerable. After he conquered level 1, level 2, we went on to level 3 and 4 and 5. And that was like looking at pictures of airplanes landing or taking off or in the air, and then watching videos of airplanes. Then finally, after about 7 weeks, and he was coming in twice a week for all of this, we actually went to the airport together and watched the planes take off and land. We did some mindfulness meditation in the airport. He got to the point where he felt like he was going to be able to get on the plane then, and he did. Now, he still experienced some anxiety while he was on the plane, but it was to the point where it was now manageable, and he was able to move on with his life and his job. So that's systematic desensitization in a nutshell, and how you can overcome or extinguish a classically conditioned response or learned response for that. Drug addiction might also be a classically conditioned response. You have the habituation upon a process theory. If you've ever done any kind of drugs, including alcohol, which is a drug, and also caffeine, you may notice that 1 cup of coffee just doesn't do it for you anymore. You might need 1 or you might need 2. And, where that single shot latte was okay, boy, now the triple shot really is good. And you might need that, and you're getting used to it, and you're habituating to the drug. And that ultimately creates or causes drug tolerance. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about instrumental and operant conditioning, which is learning by the consequences of behavior. And this is basically rewards and punishment. When you think about how young children are raised and how you were raised as a young child, you probably remember your mother or your father or your guardian, whoever your grown-up was that was raising you, may have told you, do such and such, and this is what it means to be a good boy or a good girl. When you don't do such and such, or you do something I told you not to do, then you're going to get punished. Did anyone have any creative punishments that your parents did that you want to talk about? Anybody have an example of being punished or rewarded growing up for behavior that you can recall?
Well, being rewarded, we would go out to eat, if I got A's and stuff.
Okay, so good grades meant you're going to get to go out to eat.
Yeah, and when I was really young, they'd spank me for punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But they stopped that pretty quick.
That's good news. That's good news. Yeah, I was spanked when I was a kid too. That was just the way it was. I mean, that was totally normal. They spanked you at school. They spanked you at home. Spanking was a pretty normal way to child rear. And we don't do that as much anymore, even though some people are still doing it. But one of the things that we found out, and we'll get to in a few minutes, is that largely punishment by itself doesn't always work, because what happens is people just simply try to avoid the punishment rather than actually changing their behavior. They get creative. So one of the first people, the psychologists or researchers that come up with the idea of operant conditioning is Edward Thorndike, who talked about the consequences of behavior in animal intelligence creating puzzle boxes for animals to solve. And this was learning by the law of effect or instrumental conditioning. So here's a puzzle box, and he would give pigeons and different animals or rats the opportunity to open up this box or figure it out. And the inside of the box, after they completed it or they opened it, they would get a treat or a reward. And that was called operant conditioning or positive conditioning. B.F. Skinner really took Thorndike's ideas and really extended them and formalized them and created a whole theory called behavioralism, or learning by consequences. And he thought that all creatures, humans included, all of their learning was purely on the basis of whether they were rewarded or punished by that learning. And, you know, if you had brothers or sisters, a good example of learning by consequences sometimes was watching what happened to them. And you quickly realize, wow, if I mouth off like that to dad, you know, I watched my brother get really big in trouble, so I'm certainly not going to do that. You know, and that's a way of learning that we get into in a few minutes. And that's like social modeling or learning by observation. But learning by operant conditioning is when you yourself are either rewarded or punished. Here's our old pal, B.F. Skinner. He loved working with rats, and he would teach rats all kinds of things. And usually he was the biggest believer in positive reinforcement. Have any of you ever had a cat or a dog? And usually dogs are a little bit easier to train, even though cats can be trained. It just takes more patience. But have you ever taught your dog a trick? And what trick did you teach them? And how did you teach them that trick? Anybody ever train an animal?
We taught my dog how to roll over, and we just started that by, we would like not grab her, but we would actually roll her over for her and just feed her treats every time we did that, to the point where she just did it on her own.
So the positive reward for her, you demonstrated the rolling behavior by physically rolling her. You gave her a treat. And then when she started doing it her own, you continued giving her a treat. And then it probably got to a point where you no longer had to give her a treat. You probably just gave her praise.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the praise often for animals, especially dogs, can be just as rewarding as the treat itself. But treats can be highly motivating. I have a wonderful English setter, and he's a sweet dog, but he can be quite stubborn sometimes. And in order to motivate him to do something, a food treat can be helpful. But he does respond by praise too. That's a good example. So operant is the operant response, and you can have positive or negative reinforcers. One important distinction when you're trying to figure out the difference between a reinforcer and a punishment is reinforcers always increase a behavior. So if you're trying to figure out if a stimulus is a reinforcer or a punishment, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, and we'll get into what that means in a minute. If it's a reinforcer, it's going to increase behavior. If it increases behavior, it's always a reinforcer. If it decreases behavior, then it's a punishment of some sort. So positive reinforcers is you give something to increase a behavior. I'm going to give you this donut in order to get you to go clean your room. That's a positive reinforcer. I'm going to take away your iPhone until you clean your room. That's a negative reinforcer. We're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to increase room cleaning behavior, but in one, we're giving something to get that to happen, and in the other instance, we're taking something away to make that happen. So escape and avoidance conditioning simply means that you quickly learn that if you perform a certain behavior, you can escape a punishment or a stimulus that's undesirable. Sometimes that might be a shock when you're doing a laboratory animal experiment or even human experiments. Believe it or not, they used to do shocks on humans experiments, or might be a loud sound, or any kind of aversive conditioning will create that kind of response. Sometimes. It just depends on what it is and how it looks like. So discriminative conditioning, stimuli, and stimulus control. You have stimulus discrimination, and what that means is the subject only responds to a very specific stimulus. So you hear a certain tone, and it's only the tone of just that frequency that they're responding to, and they perform a particular behavior and no other tone. That's stimulus discrimination. Stimulus generalization means they will respond to anything that approximates that particular stimulus. So here's some examples of positive reinforcement. You have a behavior, you put coins into the vending machine, you get a presentation of a pleasant and positive stimulus, you get your bag of chips or your Coke or whatever you're asking for. And so the frequency of behavior increases, you put coins in the vending machine in the future, hoping that you will get it. Unless it's at UCF. For whatever reason, none of those vending machines ever seem like they work. I'm having to shake them all the time. And if you ever see people do that, I got to the point where I just stopped. And, that's a good example of not getting my positive reinforcement. So the frequency of my behavior goes down. Negative reinforcement, the behavior is in the middle, you're in the middle of a boring date and you say you have a headache. The termination of the unpleasant stimulus, this goofball who you don't want to be with, the date ends early. And so the frequency of your behavior increases. Use the same tactic on future boring dates in order to get out of them. Oh, I have a headache. Goodbye, I have to go. So those are two examples that your books are giving you here. So here's escape conditioning. Here we have a lovely German Shepherd that this evil researcher has decided to shock. The researcher puts the animal over on one side of this room, and there's a barrier here. There's a noise that happens, or a tone, and a shock happens, the animal jumps. The avoidance condition is when all you need is either the shock or the tone, and the animal still jumps to avoid the stimulus. So stimulus discrimination. So here's an example. You give the pigeon two different pictures, and you only reward the pigeon when it pecks a particular picture. The pigeon is not rewarded when it pecks anything other than a very specific picture. Then you create what's known as stimulus discrimination. So forming and strengthening operant behavior. So you have shaping. Aiden gave a good example of his dog in shaping the dog's rolling over behavior. So they were trying to teach the dog to roll over. And at first, they had to take the dog and physically roll it over. So any approximation of the ultimate behavior they're trying to get was rewarded. There was an experiment that we did one time in class where for an entire class period, every time the professor would walk to the left side of the room, which was on the other far side of where their desk was, whenever they walked to the left side of the room, everyone would sit up and pay attention and really listen to what they had to say. When they walked to the other side of the room, or they sat at their desk, everyone would look down, would turn around and start talking and doing something else. By the end of the class, the professor was exclusively on one side of the room and would not leave. This was all shaping their behavior and totally unconscious. You're not allowed to do that to me. But it was an interesting experiment that was done like that. So yeah, primary versus secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are usually things that are needed for your biological welfare. Food and water. I'll give you food and water if you perform this task for me. Secondary reinforcers would be, money. I'll give you these slips of paper that don't, or even worse yet, nowadays, I will send a series of zeros and ones to your bank that represent what we know as money, that you can then use those credits to go and purchase things that you might desire. Those are secondary reinforcers. They have no intrinsic value in and of themselves, but we learn that we can take those things and we can trade them in for something of value. The timing of reinforcement is very important. We get into reinforcement schedules in a few minutes, but things like paychecks. When you work a job, you expect a paycheck, and you expect that paycheck to come on a regular basis and in a predictable fashion. Here at UCF, they pay me every 2 weeks. This particular week is an off-pay period, but I know based on the past behavior of the university that they have been very faithful in paying me every 2 weeks. And so I continue to perform my teaching behaviors in anticipation that I'm going to get my my continuous, predictable, scheduled reinforcement of my paycheck. That's what paychecks typically are on that type of reinforcer schedule. We'll get into that in a minute. The size of reinforcement may matter depending on a lot of different factors. But they have actually found through a lot of different experiments, even with on the job kind of stuff, that outside of your pay, you don't have to have a huge reinforcer to get someone's productivity to go up. Sometimes something very, very simple, like printing out a certificate on the computer and saying, hey, you're employee of the month because you've been working so hard, and their productivity might go up. Or may go down since they feel like that they have done so well. Maybe they can slack off. I guess it depends on the cognitions of the individual, right? So you have the reinforcement schedules, continuous reinforcement like the paycheck like we talked about, or partial intermittent reinforcement. And this is what these partial reinforcement schedules look like. So a fixed ratio is it's predictable. You have a number of necessary responses in order to get the reinforcer. You have the unpredictable, or on the average is the variable ratio. You have a number of necessary responses, and after you do a certain number of necessary responses, even though the number necessary may not be exactly the same every time, you will get some kind of reinforcement. Then you have a predictable time that must pass. That's a fixed interval reinforcer. And then you have the variable interval, time must pass first, and the reinforcer is unpredictable. Often variable interval is what slot machines at casinos are set on. You know that it's going to pay off at some point. You just don't know exactly when it's going to pay off. And the payoff is unpredictable. So that might cause you to continually put your dollar or your coins in and pull the lever. Coin in, pull the lever. Coin in, pull the lever, waiting for that reinforcer. So here's the results of 4 partial reinforcement schedules. This is the number of responses that are required. This is the time in minutes, and how it looks like in graph form. So you have schedules and extinction, partial reinforcement of effect. Sometimes people, you get tired, or the animal gets tired and they're waiting for something to happen that just never happens. You've been pulling that lever for 3 solid hours at the slot machine. You still haven't been paid off. You decide to walk away from the slot machine. And as you're walking out, someone puts 1 quarter in after you have fed it 500, and they get paid off. And that's very upsetting, of course, when that, that sort of thing happens. But that's the problem with unknown reinforcement. Accidental reinforcement, sometimes reinforcers might happen, or you might be reinforcing something that you don't mean to reinforce. So here's a good example of it. Think about this particular scenario. You have a couple. It's a man and a woman couple. And the man gets very upset whenever dinner is not on the table at exactly 5:30 when he walks in the door. What do you think might happen if the woman starts putting the dinner on the table, exactly at 5:28, 5:29? So he walks in the door and dinner's on the table. What do you think might be happening to his attitude?
Might get worse.
Might get worse.
He'd be expecting dinner at the same time every day.
Right. He's expecting dinner at the same time every day. And so, couples sometimes do this sort of thing where they accidentally reward each other for certain behaviors. You see this happening with children. Parents rewarding children. A child is at the store and they start screaming bloody murder for a particular thing. I want the lollipop. I want the lollipop. So the mother, to get away from her embarrassment, she gives the child the lollipop. What's the mom done?
She's trained the kid to whine and scream the next time she wants a lollipop.
She's possibly reinforcing the screaming behavior, right? Absolutely. So what happens if she doesn't give in, but instead she waits until the child screams it out and then calms down? And after the child calms down, then she gives the lollipop.
Then the child will know that they're not going to get what they want if they're acting, like if they're having an outburst. So they're more likely to be calm in situations where they decide they want something.
Yeah, absolutely. A big part of what you've got to do as a parent is figure out what you're reinforcing and what you're punishing and what you're ignoring as well. Sometimes you accidentally reinforce the wrong thing, or you ignore things that you should be paying attention to and reinforcing. One of the things parents often do, and part of it is not their fault, because being a parent of young children, especially when you also have a career you're trying to get going, is an exhausting experience. So what happens many times is a parent will overreact to bad behavior and underreact to good behavior. And partly what I have to do as a psychologist is teach the parent to flip-flop that. You want to overreact to good behavior and underreact to bad behavior. Because children thrive on attention. They thrive on positive attention. And quite honestly, so do our spouses and our lovers and our boyfriends and girlfriends. They also thrive on attention. And if you overreact to something that they've done that's really good, a behavior you want them to continue, you want to give positive reinforcement for behavior you want them to continue. You want to ignore behavior that you don't want to continue. So then they learn very quickly, oh, if I act this way, I get lots of attention. If I act this way, I get no attention. And that's really, quite honestly, just about the easiest way you can shape a child's behavior very quickly. It just takes a lot of consciousness on the part of the parent and exactly what they're doing with their reinforcement, even the position of their body. If I'm looking at you straight on and my body is oriented toward you you know, and I've got a bright smile on my face and I have a pleasant expression. It's like, wow, you've done a really good job. Congratulations. You know, I'm giving you lots of attention, my undivided attention. If you're doing something I don't want and I'm turned away from you and I'm just kind of giving you the eye and I'm looking away most of the time, then I'm not giving you the attention. And trying to teach a parent how to do that. Some parents catch on to it real quick, and some it can be more difficult. But in a lot of ways, puppies and children are very similar in the way you train them, and so are boyfriends. They're also very similar in the way you train them too. So why do reinforcers work? One of the ways they work is that they activate our dopamine responses or our pleasure centers. One of the things I learned really quickly in teaching is I try to give as many positive reinforcers as I can for participation behavior. So even if someone says something that is not exactly correct, I always try to say something like, hey, that's a good job. What a great question. I'm glad you asked that. Here's what it's about. So I'm giving some reinforcement for the participation behavior without punishing the participation behavior. Luckily, I didn't have a whole lot of really bad professors, but the few I did have often would punish you for participating. And, you know, you'd raise your hand and you would give an answer and sometimes it'd be wrong. And they would go, oh, what a stupid response. You know, how likely are you to participate in the future if you had a professor to do that to you? That would be no good, right? That'd be would be the opposite of activating your dopamine receptors. But when you get a reward of some kind, you get those dopamine receptors activated. That's why in casinos, when you do hit a jackpot, you know, and it might only be $25, ring, ding, 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 you know, the bells start ringing, the lights are flashing on the slot machine and things are going crazy. Or, you know, people react to you winning, or you get really excited about the win and you have a dopamine rush, and it's reinforcing on your pleasure center of your brain. So punishment reduces the frequency of any kind of behavior. And there's two basic kinds of punishment. Again, all punishments reduce or decrease behaviors. There's the positive punishment. You touch a hot iron, you have a very unpleasant stimulus, your hand is burned. And so the frequency of behaviors of touching that oven or touching that iron goes way down. So negative punishment, or having a penalty, you're careless with your ice cream cone, your removal of a pleasant stimulus, the ice cream falls to the ground. So your frequency of behavior decreases. You're not as careless with the next cone. So I'm a big believer in what are called natural consequences. You know, sometimes if a child is not, if you see that they're headed toward a natural consequence and it's not going to physically harm them or emotionally harm them too severely, sometimes letting a child learn by experience is the absolute best teacher, rather than you going around as a parent telling them every single little time what exactly is going to happen or not happen and what they should do or not do. So negative reinforcement always strengthens a behavior. Punishment always weakens a behavior for the most parts, but there are many drawbacks to punishment. One is it doesn't erase the undesired behavior. You can produce unwanted side effects. You know, spanking a child, you know, it depends on how it's done. There's a lot of studies on whether spanking works or doesn't work. Some studies have actually shown that there really isn't a whole lot of negative experiences that children suffer after spanking, and some suggest that there aren't a lot of negative experiences for it. One of the things that I think that happens with, you know, with spanking is that if there is an emotional carrier wave of anger that goes along with it, of really with any kind of punishment, that's probably more damaging to a child or even to an animal than if there's more of a neutral emotional carrier wave. Often punishment is ineffective unless it's given immediately after the undesirable behavior. So, you know, if your dog used the bathroom in the house 3 hours ago, the dog's forgotten about it long ago. If you grab the dog up and punish them, the only thing you're teaching that dog is that you are not to be trusted. You're not teaching them that what they're doing is not right. So you have to do a punishment immediately if possible, and it has to be given every single time the behavior occurs. That's why sometimes certain traffic behavior like speeding is not always curbed by the punishment we have known as tickets. You know, how many times have you sped before you actually got a ticket? You know, I might go a year of speeding almost every day before I actually get a ticket. And then I have all these devices and complex behaviors that try to help me avoid the ticket punishment, like the Waze app or the radar detector, you know, or figuring that sort of stuff out. And then even when I do get a ticket, you know, turn it over to a ticket clinic or to an attorney, you know, and get them to take care of it. Oh, hey, I won my case. The cop didn't even show up. So not only did it not produce a desired effect, lower speeding, it actually reinforced me because I stuck it to the man, you know? So that's another crazy example of sometimes punishment doesn't work. Sometimes punishment can be aggressive or abusive, and you have to be careful of that. And it informs of wrongdoings, but doesn't provide alternatives. It's much, much more effective to provide positive reinforcement for behaviors you want and to ignore behaviors you don't want, as long as the behavior you don't want is not causing damage to a person or another or someone else. Obviously, if someone is being damaging to property or to themselves, then you've got to do something about that. So here's a guideline for some effective punishments. You want to specify to a child, for example, if you're punishing a child, why the punishment is being given. Child's got to understand why you did, why are you doing what you did. You know, I had to do such and such because, you know, I specifically told you not to cut into the apple pie I just made. That was for dinner tomorrow night, and you did it anyway. Therefore, you're not going to get any more apple pie, or you're going to have to be sent to your room, or whatever the punishment might be. So emphasize that the behavior, not the person, is being punished. You want to shame someone. You know, you're not bad. The behavior you did was wrong. Here is the pathway for forgiveness. 1, acknowledge what you did was wrong. 2, figure out, or you tell me how you're going to avoid doing that in the future. And 3, you need to ask for forgiveness. And, you know, if someone asks forgiveness, you should give it to them for the most part. Some things are easier to forgive than others. So punishment should be immediate, noticeable, but without being abusive. But there's also a problem with an escalation effect. Sometimes punishments that once worked no longer work, so you have to give someone a higher level punishment. And that can be lead to a lot of problems. So there's an identify and positive reinforce more appropriate for responses. Again, as I said, positive reinforcement is much, much better at changing behavior, which is really the ultimate goal of what you're trying to accomplish, than punishment in and of itself. So life-saving punishments, you know, this might seem like a punishment when a child has to have surgery, but of course it's not really a punishment at all. You're trying to help the child. So some applications of operant conditioning, helping children to learn what is and what is not appropriate behavior, is certainly one. Developing treatment programs for alternating problematic behavior. That's called stimulus control therapy. One of the things they do in homes where you have people who are developmentally delayed or developmentally have some issues, and or even homes where people live in a who are very mentally ill and they have to live in a home, they may do things called token economies, where certain behaviors, you get a certain number of tokens, which is like money in the institution, and then you can trade that token or that money in for certain goods or services, treats or things like that. Did your parents ever put you on a reward system, like a check mark system or a token system where they would give you money or they would give you things and then you could trade that in later for something? Anyone ever have that kind of experience growing up? No.
Oh man, I went to Dave and Buster's for my birthday for like 5 years in a row there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was awesome. I got to collect all the points. I was super god at the jump rope game, jumping jackpot. And I think one of the years the machine was like broken or something because I got like 12 jackpots in a row and I just kept playing it. And so I got like thousands and thousands of points.
And then you could trade those points in at Dave and Buster's for prizes?
Yeah, for like candy. And if you got a billion bajillion points, you got like something actually cool.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example of positive reinforcement or operant conditioning. So how are learned associations stored in the brain? One is that we learn through associative network models. That's one theory. We associate some behaviors or some learned responses with others. And so they connect with one another and then you create a circuit. Some theorists have used computer models for these associations. You have one's called the parallel distributed processing model. That means distributed memory or knowledge is interconnected among nodes. And you can see this as a possibility in neural networks. I know when right now they're actually creating computers that run on neural network models. And some of the computers are actually learn on their own. And this is some of the beginning of AI. Some of them are actually have become quite scary and quite good. If you know anything about IBM's Deep Blue, that's a neural network computer that has a deep learning software architecture, and this computer can actually learn on its own. It played in a game of Jeopardy. It's played chess with people, and it's even found cures for diseases and has been able to surf through, hundreds of thousands of different studies that were done in order to find a diagnosis for a particular illness. You can imagine how long it would take a human being to go through hundreds of thousands of individual studies, and how important it might be to have a computer to be able to do some of that for you. But that's one example of maybe how learning is happening, not only in computers, but also in the human brain. So here's an example of an associative network. So you have this concept called the dog. And then you have everything that is associated with dog. It might be the D sounds, a door, a daisy, or danger. It might be things that are associated with the dog itself, like, for example, a tree or a bark, or even another animal, a seal that kind of looks like a dog. Other animals, snakes, cats, pets. This is another association. The dog might be your companion or a friend. Dog might bite, and that causes pain. What else bites? Insects. What else causes pain? Dentists, fires, danger. Protection, guard, lock, police. So you can see how all of these different, what seem like very different concepts are related to a single concept. And this is a kind of one theory of how we actually encode memories and how we encode learnings in associative networks in our neural architecture in our brain. Kind of fascinating. It makes sense in some ways because, sometimes when you're trying to think of a particular concept, or you're trying to think of, for example, you're trying to think of a band, the name of a particular rock and roll band or a popular musical band, and you start naming every band you can think of that is around the name that you're trying to reach to, you know, you're activating your associative network for musical groups is a good example. All right, so cognitive processes and learning. Can people learn to be helpless? Learned helplessness. Yeah, we've seen that happen quite a bit. You see this happen in people who have been abused for a long time. You know, one of the things that happens sometimes in abusive relationships is we ask the person who had been abused, well, why didn't you just leave? You know, why'd you stay with the abuser all that time? And on the outside, it makes sense. Well, gosh, I'd never let that happen to me. I would just pack up while they were at work or whatever, and I'd get in the car and I'd drive away. But when you learn helplessness, you begin to learn that your options are less and less and fewer and fewer and fewer until you get to a certain point where you no longer feel like you have any more options. That is sometimes how it happens in human beings. You see this happen in animals who have been mistreated or abused. They get to a point where they just stop flinching at all the beatings. They know it's coming. They know there's nothing they can do about it, and they just kind of lay there and let it happen. Very sad, but that's an example of learned helplessness. Cognitive processes and learning, as we had talked about earlier, cognitive is thinking. It's learning that can involve complex mental processes like forming mental representations of a particular concept, having expectations of that concept or making generalizations about it. And then learned helplessness, as we said, is a tendency to give up on efforts to control the environment. The I can't do it attitude can lack of control over the environment lead to helplessness in humans. So how did the researcher answer this? Phase 1, they had one group and they could not stop bursts of loud, obnoxious noise. Group 2 could control the noise by pressing a button to turn it off. And group 3 heard no noise. So what do you think happened in the behavior? What kind of behaviors would you expect out of these 3 groups, do you think?
I think group 1 would just get like frustrated and annoyed.
Okay. Group 1 might get frustrated and annoyed. What else?
Group 2 may be like super vigilant.
Yeah, the annoying noise is so annoying that they know they can turn it off with that button, so they're very vigilant. They're waiting for that noise happening. They're going to hit the button. And then group 3, we wouldn't expect much out of them because they're just kind of chilling out. There's no stimulus happening, right?
They might get confused because they don't know what's going on.
Say that again?
Would they get confused because like maybe they're expecting something and like nothing happens?
Right. Well, I'm a part of this study, but nothing's going on. What's going on, right? So in the study, phase 2, all groups could prevent the noise if they acted quickly to push the lever. Half told that the ability to avoid or escape noise depended on their skill, but half were told that success would be a matter of random chance. That's interesting. So what did the researcher find? That those who previously experienced lack of control now failed to control the noise because they thought it was just random chance. And the expectation of control had an effect on their behavior. That's really fascinating. So how do you think this would play out in real life? So for example, someone has the expectation that they have an effect over their environment and over their own destiny, while others feel that no, they're not going to have any effect over their environment, over their destiny. It's just up to random chance, depending on how I'm going to turn out. What behaviors would you expect out of those people, those 2 groups, their life, depending on what cognition or what belief they held? Did you understand my premise?
So this is after the first phase where some of them could control it and some couldn't.
Yeah, but what I mean is even outside of this research study, if you yourself feel that you have control over your life, how is that going to affect your behavior?
Probably going to be more confident.
Yeah.
And probably going to take more steps to keep that control if you feel like you have it.
Yeah. Not only that, but you're going to put the work in because you feel like what you're doing is going to pay off in some ways. Yeah, that's kind of the expectancy effect in some ways, and it's also an interesting thing that we tell that I often will tell parents. Sometimes parents will come in and they will want their child to have an intellectual test for whatever reason. Sometimes it's for giftedness. Sometimes they might suspect a learning disability. Sometimes the child may need special services. It just depends. But no matter what the child's outcome, I never tell the parent that the child's intellectual abilities are fixed. In other words, your child has a 110 IQ, 100 being the mean. They have 110 IQ. I never say it's fixed. It'll be 110 now. It'll never change. Instead, I tell them that I give them what's known as a growth mindset. I say, your child can continue to improve their IQ, continue to get smarter, and continue to be more successful the harder they work, the more study they put in. And I tell the child this as well. So if you have a fixed mindset over a growth mindset, how might that change your own life in some ways? You think about that. Because people who have a growth mindset are more likely to believe that their own behaviors are going to improve their life, aren't they? Mm-hmm. So the results.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Elizabeth.
This is an incredibly interesting thing when you think about the psychology of a culture or a certain group of people.
That's right.
I lived a significant portion of my life in Jackson, Mississippi, really close to a extremely disadvantaged area.
Uh-huh.
And that particularly disadvantaged area, people kind of had the mindset that they couldn't make it out. So a lot of those people turned inward. It was one of those neighborhoods where you would expect a lot of police activity because there were a lot of exchanges of drugs. There were a lot of shootings going on in there, gang activity, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so the education system in there as well was very poor. So as I was growing up there, there was an attempt to kind of move in and change the mindset of the people and let them know, you're not going to be in Jackson, Mississippi forever. You are going to make it out of this neighborhood. Mm-hmm. But even if you look at it on a national level, that's something that happens extremely often, where certain disadvantaged groups think that they're going to be disadvantaged forever. So they keep themselves there. There's not a growth mindset, like you said. There's not any sort of attempt for upward mobility. So it's something that I often think about and that just really interests me because of my own experience. But yeah, that's it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because you're right on the right track, and that couldn't be more relevant to what we're talking about in a lot of ways. Now, that's not to say that, just because you have a growth mindset automatically means you're going to be successful, of course. But what it does mean is that at least you're giving yourself in some ways a kind of a fighting chance. I look at a good example in my own life. I grew up in a very poor community in a little tiny town up in the panhandle of Florida. But one of the ways I was very privileged, even in that little tiny town, was that I had parents and grandparents who valued education and went out of their way to take me to the library, to buy me books, and to tell me things like, you could be governor one day, or you could be the president one day, or you could be anything you wanted, you know? And so, you know, I certainly grew up with a growth mindset, in a mindset that I could do what I wanted to do. While, you know, some people who grew up in more disadvantaged areas who didn't have that mindset, or were told constantly, you'll never make it, you can't get out of here, everything is against you, you might as well not even try, no matter how hard you try, you're never going to get out. Absolutely, that's a lot more of a difficult barrier to overcome. And a lot of times, you know, when people talk about things like systemic racism, or they talk about the systemic issues that hold disadvantaged groups back, that's a big part of what they're talking about, is the growth versus the fixed mindset. And so, you know, we all have to work against that in some ways, and to help lift one another up. So yeah, great example, Elizabeth. All right. So what do we still need to know when it came to the I can't attitude? Is that when and how does learned helplessness affect people's thoughts, feelings, and actions? One might be a pessimistic explanatory style. You know, if you have a pessimistic view of the world and things are against you, then it's more difficult to have the motivation to work toward getting out. That's one of the reasons I love positive psychology so much, because what I love reading about is the people who come out of those disadvantaged areas, or sometimes the worst, most abusive kind of childhoods or traumatic events, and they overcome it, and they thrive, and they become something much bigger. How did that happen? You know, what was it about their life? What was it about their history that allowed that to happen? One of the studies shows that what people typically need is to have at least one positive caregiver in their life can make a huge, gigantic difference. The people who come from really, really tough backgrounds, who survive anyway, all of the studies show that they had a coach, a teacher, a pastor, might have been a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, someone in their life was instrumental in both encouraging them as well as mentoring them and helping them realize that there was more to it out in the world, and they could get out of it. And that helped to overcome the learned helplessness. So pass it on and be a good mentor for other people. So latent learning is learning that is not evident when it first occurs. You know, sometimes you learn a skill like playing the cello or the ukulele, and you've kind of learned a few things, and you sleep on it, and the next day you get up and you're like, wow, okay. You've incorporated it, and now suddenly that song that was so tedious to get through begins to happen very effortlessly. That's latent learning. Cognitive map is a mental representation of some physical arrangement. You create a cognitive map whenever you go to a new and unfamiliar place. Believe it or not, you do. And the more times you go there, the more you learn the map in your head, and the easier it is to navigate that new physical space. So if you go to a new shopping center, for example, or you're working in a new business that has a lot of rooms, it may take you a couple of days or a few hours, depending on how big it is, to create your cognitive map, to know where everything is, but ultimately you can figure it out. You can create cognitive maps even of single objects. So like the dashboard of your car, trying to figure out what all the buttons do when you first have a new car, until you really learn everything, and then it becomes quite effortless. So here's an example of latent learning they gave this mouse a maze to try to get through. And at the end of the maze is a treat. So group C was reinforced on day 11. Group A reinforced after each time they performed the trial. And group B was never reinforced. So what we learn here is that group C ultimately had the fewest errors and demonstrated some latent learning, even though they were reinforced later on. So group C had a very similar pattern to group B until it got to day 11, and then they were reinforced and their number of errors went way down. Group A, they were reinforced after each trial, and so they got a little bit better and better, but they never had that steep desire, I guess, to eliminate the errors. Group B never reinforced. They just figured it out. And I guess the reinforcement was just the pleasure of getting through the maze. So insight is a sudden understanding of the problem as a whole. You know, you may have this experience when you're working on a math problem. You know how to do the math problem. It's very frustrating trying to figure it out. And then suddenly it comes to you. You remember, oh yeah, my order of operations, you know, both sides of the equal sign have got a balance. Oh yeah, this is how you do it. And so, you know, you figure it out. Or even the insight into a problem, something like, how in the world am I going to load all this stuff out of my apartment into this tiny U-Haul van? It's kind of like playing Tetris in some ways until it kind of comes to you. You know, that's examples of insight. Observational learning, social learning, learning by watching others. I'm definitely a learning by doing kind of person and a learning by watching someone else do it. Nothing is more satisfying than getting to learn how to do a new skill by an expert. So whether it's swinging a golf club or a tennis racket or learning to play a musical instrument, if you have a really good teacher who can teach you how to do that particular thing or that particular skill by showing it to you, it's so much easier than to pick it up and learn it on your own later. Mirror neurons are really fascinating, and what mirror neurons do is that when you're watching someone perform a behavior, even though you may not necessarily be doing it yourself, as that person is doing that behavior, in your brain, the areas that are responsible for motor coordination, for sensory input, for the visual representation of what you're seeing, the auditory, all of the circuits of your brain that are being activated by the person you're watching are also being activated in you, in your brain, as if it is a mirror. That's an example of a mirror neuron. You have mirror neurons that occur as well when a mother and child are looking at one another. Sometimes you have an infant, and the infant is in the mother's arms, and she's cradling the infant, and she's looking at the infant. And they're staring at one another, and the baby might be breastfeeding, or she might be feeding the baby the bottle, or she might just be cuddling the baby and giving the baby some attention. And the more you are staring at the baby, you begin setting up mirror neurons with that baby. And what they have found is that the EEG pattern of the mother and the child begin to actually sync with one another. And they create what we think of as a bond. Years and years later, we do this with our boyfriends and girlfriends or our significant others. We look at them in the eyes, you know, and oh, we go googly-eyed and oh, baby, you're so beautiful. I love you. And, you know, we begin setting up mirror neurons with them, and that creates a very similar kind of bonding experience, and we experience what's known as falling in love with the other person. And that really is just a set of mirror neurons that are getting set up. Typically, unless you are in a close relationship with someone, you don't look at them in the eye for more than 8 seconds. If you look at another human being in the eye for more than 8 seconds, you will activate your fight, flight, or bonding instincts. And so you have to kind of figure out what's going to happen. Now, if you're welcoming the eye contact and you're wanting the person to be in your life and you're on a date and you're, then it's wonderful and you're enjoying it. If you're just at Walmart, trying to get groceries or pick up something and you're pushing the cart along and you're moving along the cart and this guy is by you and they're staring at you, it's very uncomfortable. Then your fight or flight, is going on. And that's not a good example of positive mirror neurons. But they're all influenced by the models that we see and whether or not those models are punished or rewarded for their behavior. We can also get vicarious conditioning, like we had talked about earlier. You see your brother or your sibling get punished for something. You decide not to do that behavior because you're going to learn not to do it. Or even more sneaky, if you're real smart, you learn how to get away with it a lot better than your sibling did. And it also is important for the socialization process. So here's an example of observational learning. This is an old experiment called the Bobo doll experiment. What they did is they had a group of preschoolers in a classroom. A woman enters the classroom. She walks up to the Bobo doll and she kicks the stew out of the thing and starts punching it around. Then she leaves. That's all she does. Doesn't talk to the children, doesn't do anything. She just attacks the Bobo doll and beats it up. Well, guess what happens when she leaves the room? The kids go over and they are far more aggressive toward the doll than they were otherwise. Control groups were either not aggressive at all to the Bobo doll, or when the control group was shown a non-aggressive model, so the person just went in and picked up the Bobo doll, or they might have hugged it, or they might have done something else, then there was less aggression. So this was an old experiment that was done all the way back in the 50s and 60s, and it led a lot of people to believe that the violence children were seeing on television was actually causing them to enact violence in real life. We see the same thing that is brought up often with video games. The video games I grew up with were Pong and Asteroids and the stuff on Atari. Nowadays, video games are so realistic, it's like almost watching a movie. And when you kill someone, you see the individual blood splatters and all of that stuff. What do you think? Do you think video games lead to violent behavior, or do you think that's a cop-out by society just saying that?
I think it's more of a cop-out.
Do you play video games, Kyle?
I'm David.
Oh, I was the one talking.
Oh, David, do you play video games?
Yeah. Yes, plenty of violent ones too.
So, but it hasn't caused you to go on a murderous rampage?
Not that I know of, at least.
That's good news. That's good news.
Yeah, no, when I'm playing Doom, I just feel really pumped. It's only when I'm playing like Animal Crossing that I want to go on a murderous rampage.
Oh no. I heard Animal Crossing was so sweet. That's
yeah, no, that game gets frustrating though.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well those are good examples.
I would say there's like a desensitization to video games, but it doesn't make people aggressive.
You feel like it desensitizes them against violence, like the violence doesn't cause as many reactions as it normally would. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the argument that video games specifically cause violence because you're the one in control, I think that's what's not true. I think it is as like desensitizing as like a particularly graphic movie would be. I don't think the fact that you're in control changes anything at all, really.
I disagree personally, just because I I mean, I've become at this point kind of desensitized to watching violence in movies. But then I can't even remember what I was playing. It was just some video game where I was having to kill people, and I felt physically sick doing that.
Oh, wow.
So I think, I don't know. There's definitely a difference between video games and movies.
Mhm.
Watching and doing.
Yeah, because in the video games, you are in some ways, you're not a passive observer like you are in just watching a movie. In a video game, even though it's a digital representation, you're the one that's pulling the trigger that's killing that person. And so for Elizabeth, it actually made her physically sick. So that's interesting. So it may be having the opposite effect. What a lot of studies have shown is that that video games don't particularly cause anyone to be violent who would not ordinarily have been violent anyway. In some ways, people who have low levels of control, it may cause that desensitization effect more so than otherwise. But most of us, know the difference between pretend and real. And we understand that the video game is just a fantasy.
I would think, yeah. I'd compare like most video games that are graphic to like a Marvel movie. I think the vast majority of video games aren't similar to like super dark, depressing, like where you should feel bad for murdering these people.
Mm-hmm.
But it depends on the game.
So this is thinking critically about this sort of thing. In this study, watching violence on TV causes violent behaviors in viewers. That's the hypothesis. And what is the evidence available to support the claim? Of course, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence and case studies. There's plenty of people who come out, oh, my child was an upstanding citizen of the world. And then they started watching all of these horror movies. The next thing I know, they've got the butcher knife and they're stabbing Fluffy the dog or their brother or whatever. You have those anecdotal stories. You have correlational studies where, someone might do a study where it says, gosh, around October 31st, when a lot of horror movies come out, the amount of violence that happens also goes up. Therefore, people think, oh, one causes the other. But of course, I hope you know that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Correlation in and of itself is just an associative respect. Did you have something, Giovanni? Or
sorry, I just forgot to mute.
Oh, that's okay. And then you have experimental studies where like the Bobo dog experiment that we just talked about, where you actually see if children will mimic a violent behavior that they observe. So we kind of went through this a little bit. So correlational studies are never conclusive. So we need further evidence from controlled experiments, but there's potential for ethical problems, of course. Watching TV violence is one cause of violent behavior, especially in some children, but not in all children. What a lot of the other studies have shown is that when children are watching violent movies of any kind, or really watching content of any kind with their parents or with a trusted adult who can interpret what's being seen as it's happening, they're far, far less likely to be violent than if they're watching it alone, where there's no one to modulate or interpret what they're seeing. And in some ways, that makes sense a lot too, because you're interfering with their cognitions and you're helping to modulate that in some way. All right, so using research on learning to help people learn, what are teachers doing? One of the ways that are improving schools using psychological methods is using active learning. So electronic media versus traditional methods. A lot of the studies have shown that people can learn in an electronic way almost as effectively as they learn in person. But it also depends on the skill, and it depends on what is being taught. In my opinion, I think that if you're just giving someone, a set of facts to learn, probably electronic media learning is just as effective as hands-on. But if you're trying to teach a person a specific skill that's real hands-on, you might need to do it face-to-face. That seems to be more practical and maybe a situation where the person is learning a lot better. So why are there cross-cultural differences in students' performances? One might be applying operant conditioning principles. One thing that your culture might value may not be valued by another person's culture. So figuring out, what exactly is being valued in that culture and finding how to link that with learning outcomes could be real helpful. And then the importance of distributed practice, which means practicing a little bit of a particular skill every day, a little bit at a time, is what is helpful. But a lot of studies have shown about learning a lot of material like you have to in a college course is sitting down and reading and learning it in 90-minute increments and then taking a 10 or 15-minute break seems to be the best way to learn that particular kind of material. Does anyone else have any kind of study tips for how you learn information in your classes? How do you learn it?
For me personally, I feel like it is helpful. Like I have to take breaks every now and then. And even if it's not like anything big, even if I just get up and like move just for a little bit, even if I just walk around for a little bit and then I sit back down, I find that I'm a lot more focused and able to assimilate the information better.
Absolutely. So Catherine agrees with the study and then break method. Yeah. And, there's only so much you can assimilate anyway. And then you have to ultimately give yourself a little break to figure things out. All right, so that's our learning slideshow and lecture for this evening. As we had said earlier, there is a exam that will be happening on 3 of your chapters, 1, 2, and 4. And so study hard, but if you've attended the lectures or you've gone back and listened to them and you've read the book, you won't have any problem. This is an open book test as well. I always get a lot of emails from the very rule-governed students who are like, I know it's online, but is it open book? Like, how am I going to know? One way or another. Of course it's open book. And if I say, no, it's not open book, then what's going to happen is you're punishing the rule-governed students, and the ones who are rebels, you're rewarding, because they're going to break the rules anyway. So yeah, it's open book. And the way I look at these exams too is it's just one more opportunity for you to learn the material and to assimilate it in some ways. I find psychology, it can be a very practical kind of discipline because you learn a lot about different techniques and tools that you can take with you in life that can be helpful, even if you decide not to major in psychology. It can be real helpful. So I hope that you do learn some practical things in here while you're here with me. Any questions about anything going on in the class or any more questions about tonight's lecture? All right, I'll stick around. If anybody needs anything, you can email me or text me. I'm happy to help you. Otherwise, have a great evening, everybody. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Oh, just
Thanks,
really
Professor.
quickly, is the quiz like multiple choice, short answer, and saying?
I didn't understand you,
Okay.
Giovanni.
Sorry. Just really quickly, is the quiz multiple choice, essay, short answer, fill in the blank?
Oh, it's all multiple choice.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye.